The sun had barely risen, casting a warm, golden light over the vast ocean. The cargo ship Horizon Queen glided smoothly over the calm waters of the Pacific. The crew, experienced and ready for another long journey, went about their morning routines. The captain, James Holloway, a man who had spent over 30 years at sea, stood on the bridge, scanning the horizon. His weathered face showed no sign of worry. This was a route he had sailed many times before. Below deck, Mark Simmons, a young and eager deckhand, went about his duties. It was his first voyage on this particular ship, and he was excited to be part of a seasoned crew. He had always dreamed of working on the ocean, and now that dream had come true. Every day felt like an adventure, from cleaning the deck to helping the officers with navigation. Mark was determined to prove himself to the older crew members, who often gave him teasing smiles, seeing him as the new guy. The routine of the ship was peaceful, with the sound of the waves gently hitting the sides of the ship. The air was fresh, filled with the salty scent of the ocean. The ship's engine hummed steadily, and everything seemed perfect. Even though the ocean was vast and endless, it felt safe to the crew, like a trusted companion that had been there for them all their lives. Suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere was broken when the radio crackled to life. It was an unexpected message from another ship. "We need help. Something is wrong. We are stranded. Coordinates." The voice was shaky, filled with panic, and then it cut off abruptly. The crew stared at the radio in disbelief. Captain Holloway quickly ordered the ship to change course toward the coordinates, unsure of what they would find. The ship's course was altered, and the crew's mood shifted from calm to alert. No one could shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. Mark stood at the side of the deck, his heart pounding. The thought of an emergency in the middle of the ocean was unsettling. He had heard stories of strange things happening on the water. Ships disappearing, strange lights, and mysterious disappearances. Though he had always dismissed those stories as myths, standing there on the deck now, he couldn't help but feel a chill. The Horizon Queen cut through the calm water, heading toward the last known location of the distress call. The skies were clear, and the ocean seemed peaceful, yet a strange tension hung in the air. As the ship neared the coordinates, something seemed off. There was no sign of the other vessel, no floating debris, no wreckage, nothing. Holloway ordered the crew to prepare to investigate, his sharp instincts telling him that the situation was far from ordinary. Little did they know, the crew was about to stumble upon something that would change their lives forever, something that would haunt them for the rest of their days on the ocean. The vast, open sea was about to reveal its darker, more mysterious side. The Horizon Queen slowly approached the coordinates given by the mysterious distress call. The air felt still, almost unnaturally quiet, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. The crew gathered on the deck, looking out over the water for any sign of the other ship. Captain Holloway stood at the helm, his brow furrowed in thought. He had been at sea for decades, but something about this situation made him uneasy. As they got closer, the crew could see a large ship in the distance. It was stationary, drifting aimlessly, but it didn't look like a typical vessel. The ship's shape was old, worn, and clearly abandoned. Its hull was rusty, and the sails had long since deteriorated, hanging loosely like tattered cloth. It seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong on the calm ocean at all. Mark's heart raced as they drew nearer. He had heard of abandoned ships before. Some ships were left behind when their crews vanished, or when storms and disasters struck. But he had never seen anything like this. The ship was large, perhaps even larger than the Horizon Queen, and it looked strangely lifeless. There were no lights on board, no movement at all. As the ship loomed closer, Holloway ordered the crew to lower a small lifeboat. The plan was to board the abandoned ship, find out what had happened, and see if anyone was still alive. Mark was part of the team chosen to investigate. He felt a mix of excitement and dread. This was his chance to prove himself, but the eerie silence surrounding the abandoned ship made him nervous. The lifeboat was lowered into the water with a creak, and the crew climbed aboard, their movements careful and deliberate. Mark could feel his pulse racing in his ears as they rowed closer to the ghostly ship. The closer they got, the more unsettling the sight became. There was no sign of life. No crew, no animals, nothing. Only the sound of the water lapping against the sides of their small boat filled the air. When they reached the abandoned ship, Holloway signaled for the crew to board. The moment Mark set foot on the rotting wooden deck, he felt a strange coldness, as if the ship was draining warmth from the air around them. The floorboards creaked under their weight, but there was no other sound. It was as though the ship had been frozen in time, left untouched by the world for years. They began to explore, moving cautiously through the ship's long corridors. The air inside was stale and heavy, and a musty smell lingered in the rooms. They found several cabins, but they were empty, as if the people who had lived there had simply vanished. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of any kind of violence, just empty spaces where life had once existed. Mark's mind raced with questions. What had happened to the crew? Why had they left everything behind? The deeper they ventured into the ship, the more unsettled Mark became. There was something off about this place, something that made his skin crawl. As he moved through the dark hallways, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Then, in one of the cabins, Mark found something that made his blood run cold. A logbook. The last entry was dated just a few days ago. It was a single, chilling line. Something is in the water, watching. The moment Mark read the logbook entry, his hands started to shake. The words seemed to jump off the page, echoing in his mind. Something is in the water, watching. He stared at the faded handwriting for a long time, trying to make sense of it. But the more he thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. He couldn't shake the feeling that the crew of this ship had been running from something, or someone. "Mark, you okay?" One of the other crew members, Ben, asked as he walked into the cabin, snapping Mark out of his thoughts. Mark held up the logbook, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at this. The last entry. It says something's in the water. Watching." Ben's face tightened, and he looked around the dark room, as if the walls themselves were listening. "That's creepy. But we haven't seen anything in the water." "Exactly," Mark replied, his voice tinged with nervousness. "But I have this feeling that whatever's out there, it's watching us now, waiting." Ben didn't reply, but he clearly felt the same unease. The whole crew had been growing more tense as they explored the ship. Every room they entered seemed colder than the last, and the strange silence of the place made it feel as if it had been abandoned for much longer than it actually had. After Mark showed the logbook to the others, they decided to search the rest of the ship. They moved cautiously, checking every room, every hallway, but finding no signs of life. Everything was eerily untouched, as if the people who had been aboard had simply disappeared in the middle of their day-to-day activities. It was almost like they had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their belongings, frozen in time. But something wasn't right. As Mark walked down one of the narrow hallways, he noticed strange marks on the walls. Deep scratches, like something had clawed its way through. They weren't made by a human hand. The grooves were too large, the pattern too wild. The air felt colder as he examined them, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "Look at this," Mark called to the others, pointing at the markings. "What could have made these?" Holloway, who had been leading the search, approached. He ran his fingers over the deep scratches, his expression grim. "I've seen some strange things at sea, but nothing like this. We need to be careful." As they continued their search, the strange feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every creak of the ship felt like a whisper, every shadow seemed to shift just out of the corner of their eyes. It wasn't just the silence, it was the sense that something was there, something invisible but undeniably present, lurking in the dark corners of the ship. At one point, Mark heard a faint noise, like a door creaking open. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The rest of the crew was ahead of him, unaware of the noise. He shrugged it off, telling himself it was just the ship settling. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The crew felt it too. They couldn't explain it, but they all shared the same unease. The ship wasn't just abandoned, it was haunted, somehow, by a presence that refused to leave. When Mark entered the engine room, his eyes widened in shock. The room was flooded with water, but there was no sign of where the water had come from. No broken pipes, no obvious leaks. The ship was sinking, but slowly, quietly, as if the water had been there for days. And that's when Mark saw something he couldn't forget. A long, dark shape moving in the water, too big to be a fish. He quickly turned to leave, his heart racing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't friendly. The tension among the crew was growing thicker with every passing minute. As they gathered on deck to discuss what they had found, a heavy silence hung in the air. No one could explain the strange occurrences they had experienced on the ship, but everyone felt it. Something was wrong. The logbook, the scratches, the flooded engine room, and the chilling cold that seemed to follow them wherever they went. It was all too much to ignore. Captain Holloway stood at the front of the group, his face hard with determination. He had seen many things at sea, but this was different. His voice was low, steady as he addressed the crew. "We're getting off this ship. Now. Whatever's going on here, it's not something we want to stick around for." The crew members nodded, relief flooding their expressions. They had all felt it, the heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to watch them from the shadows. No one wanted to stay any longer than they had to. They quickly made their way back to the lifeboat, ready to leave the ghostly ship behind. But just as they began to lower the boat back into the water, something happened. The loud, unsettling noise came from below deck, like a deep growl, low and guttural. It echoed through the hull of the ship, vibrating the air. Mark froze. The others looked at each other, fear flashing in their eyes. Holloway ordered everyone to stay still, his hand held up in a signal to halt. For a moment, everything was silent again. But the noise didn't stop. It came again, closer this time. A long, sharp sound that seemed to vibrate through their bones. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. What was that? Was it the wind or something worse? Holloway's eyes scanned the deck, narrowing as he listened. "We need to move quickly," he said, his voice sharp. He turned to the crew, his eyes hardening. "Get in the lifeboat. We're leaving now." But as the crew started to climb into the lifeboat, the ship shook violently, throwing everyone off balance. The Horizon Queen rocked as if something massive had struck it. The crew stumbled, gripping whatever they could to stay steady. Mark felt his stomach drop as he realized what was happening. It wasn't just the wind or the waves. The ship was moving, and it wasn't moving in the way a ship should. The Horizon Queen tilted, as if something was pulling it down into the water. Mark's eyes darted to the horizon, and that's when he saw it. A massive, dark shape rising from the ocean, gliding effortlessly through the water, casting a shadow over the entire ship. It was too large to be a whale, too massive to be anything natural. It twisted and moved with an eerie grace, like something ancient and powerful, and it was heading straight for them. Captain Holloway shouted orders, his voice urgent, but no one could hear him over the deafening roar of the waves crashing around them. The lifeboat, now hanging precariously at the side of the ship, was their only chance. But as they climbed into it, the shadow in the water grew closer, and the ship shuddered again, this time with more force. Mark looked down at the water below. It was no longer calm. It was alive, twisting and churning as the creature below them seemed to react to their movements. He could feel its presence, like a dark force beneath the surface, watching them. The air felt thick and heavy as if the ocean itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The lifeboat finally hit the water with a splash, and the crew scrambled into it, their faces pale and filled with panic. As they began to row away from the Horizon Queen, Mark couldn't take his eyes off the water. The shape below them was still there, moving closer, its shadow stretching longer, darker. He didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever it wasn't going to let them go without a fight. The crew of the Horizon Queen rowed desperately, their muscles aching as they fought against the churning waters. The lifeboat rocked wildly with every wave, and the air was thick with tension. Every time Mark glanced over his shoulder, he could see the dark shadow in the water, moving just beneath the surface. It wasn't just the size of it that terrified him. It was the way it seemed to follow them, as if it knew exactly where they were. Captain Holloway gripped the oars with white knuckles, his face tight with concentration. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but even he couldn't hide the worry in his eyes. "Row faster," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the crashing waves. "We need to get out of here before it catches us." Mark's heart raced. He had heard stories of sea creatures, of legends and myths, but he had never believed in them. Now, though, he couldn't deny what was happening. There was something in the water, something big, something ancient, and it wasn't going to let them escape that easily. As the crew struggled to row, the water around them grew colder, the sea turning an unnatural shade of dark blue. The ocean had become alive, and every wave seemed to pulse with a strange energy. It wasn't just the creature they feared anymore. The sea itself seemed to be against them. Then, without warning, the shadow beneath the surface surged upward, breaking through the water with a roar. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he saw the creature for the first time. Its enormous body rising from the depths, its scales glistening in the pale light. It was massive, far larger than any sea creature he had ever seen, with limbs that twisted and coiled in the water like thick ropes. Its eyes, black, soulless, and endless, seemed to lock onto them, watching with an intelligence that sent a chill down Mark's spine. The lifeboat lurched violently, and one of the crew members cried out as they lost their balance. They struggled to keep the boat steady, but the creature was already moving toward them, its form emerging from the water like a nightmare come to life. Mark could hear the sound of its massive body slithering through the sea, each movement causing the water to ripple in strange patterns. "We need to get out of here," shouted Ben, panic rising in his voice. "It's coming closer." Holloway's voice was firm, though his eyes betrayed his fear. "Keep rowing. Don't look back. Just row." But no matter how hard they rowed, it was clear that they were no match for the creature. It moved faster, its long, dark body cutting through the water with terrifying speed. The sound of its approach grew louder with each passing second, a low, rumbling noise that echoed through the lifeboat, shaking Mark to his core. Suddenly, the boat jerked again, and Mark was thrown forward. He looked up just in time to see the creature's enormous head rise from the water, its gaping mouth opening wide, as if to swallow them whole. The crew shouted in fear, scrambling to get away, but the lifeboat was stuck. The ocean around them seemed to tighten, as if it were pulling them closer to the creature. In that moment, Mark realized that there was no escape. The creature was closing in, and the sea had become its hunting ground. The only thing they could do was hold on and hope for the best. The lifeboat rocked violently as the enormous creature loomed closer, its massive head emerging from the water like a dark mountain rising from the depths. Mark's heart raced, and his thoughts became a blur. The boat was trapped, and no matter how hard they rowed, there was no escape from the creature that seemed to have cornered them. The sea around them churned as the creature's long body twisted and coiled beneath the surface, moving with an eerie grace. "Keep calm, everyone," Captain Holloway shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. "We need to stay focused." Mark tried to steady himself in the boat, but it felt like the water itself was alive, pushing against them. The air was thick with tension, and the sound of the creature's breathing, a deep guttural sound, was like a drumbeat in Mark's chest. It wasn't just the creature's size that terrified him. It was the way it seemed to watch them, its dark eyes filled with an intelligence that sent chills down his spine. The crew was struggling, their faces pale and frantic as they tried to row. But the creature was too close now. It was impossible to outrun something so massive. Mark could feel the heat radiating off the creature's body as it hovered just beneath the surface, its eyes never leaving them. "Row! Row faster!" Ben shouted, his voice tight with panic. Mark's hands were trembling as he gripped the oar. His mind raced with questions, but the only thing that mattered now was getting away from the creature. But it was no use. The creature surged forward again, its enormous body breaking through the surface with terrifying speed. Mark barely had time to react before the lifeboat was hit by a massive wave. The boat tipped violently, throwing the crew off balance. Water flooded in, drenching them all as they struggled to stay afloat. Mark grabbed onto the side of the boat, his knuckles white. He glanced around, desperate to find a way out, but all he saw was the creature. It was everywhere, its massive shape looming just beneath the surface of the water, ready to strike. The crew was shouting, trying to get the boat under control, but nothing seemed to help. The creature was too close now, and its eyes were locked onto them, unblinking. Captain Holloway barked orders, his voice strong despite the fear that gripped him. "We need to get to the open water, away from the ship." But Mark knew it was too late. The creature was already closing in, its massive jaws opening wide, ready to swallow them whole. Time seemed to slow as Mark's mind raced. He could see the creature's sharp teeth glistening in the dim light, its body coiling in the water like a snake preparing to strike. "Hold on," Holloway yelled, just as the creature's massive tail slammed into the side of the boat. The lifeboat was thrown into the air, spinning wildly as the water surged beneath them. Mark was thrown off balance, his grip slipping from the edge of the boat. For a moment, he felt weightless, the world spinning around him. Then with a splash, he hit the water, cold, dark, and unforgiving. He gasped for air, his chest tightening as he struggled to stay above the surface. The creature was close now, its shadow looming beneath him. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he kicked his legs frantically, trying to swim toward the boat. But the creature was faster, and he could feel it, lurking just beneath the water, waiting for him to slip up. He couldn't let it catch him. He had to get back to the boat, or there would be no chance of surviving. Here's the expanded version of Part 7, keeping it simple, engaging, and under 500 words. Mark's heart raced as he struggled to keep his head above the water. The cold was unbearable, and every time he took a breath, the water seemed to pull him deeper. He could feel the creature lurking just below him, its dark shadow stretching through the water like a giant, waiting for the right moment to strike. Panic gripped him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to get back to the lifeboat, or he was as good as gone. He kicked his legs harder, his muscles aching with the effort. The boat was just ahead, but it seemed so far away. He could hear the frantic shouts of his crew above him, but their voices were muffled by the sound of the waves crashing around him. The lifeboat was still floating, but it was drifting further away, pushed by the current. Suddenly, there was a splash behind him, and Mark whipped around. The creature's massive form rose from the depths, its jaws snapping shut just inches from his feet. Mark's blood ran cold. He was too close now. He could see the creature's sharp teeth, glistening in the dim light. It was ready to strike. With a surge of adrenaline, Mark kicked harder, his arms flailing as he swam toward the lifeboat. He could feel the water swirling around him, and he knew the creature was closing in. The boat seemed so far away, but he couldn't give up now. Every second counted. Just as his fingers brushed the edge of the boat, the water beneath him surged again. The creature was coming for him. He scrambled to pull himself up, his hands slipping on the slick surface of the boat. His breath was coming in gasps, and his chest felt tight with fear. But then a hand reached out to him. It was Ben, his face pale but determined. "Grab my hand," Ben shouted over the roar of the waves. Mark reached up, his hand trembling, and grabbed onto Ben's. With all the strength he had left, he pulled himself up into the boat. Ben hauled him over the side, and together they collapsed onto the floor of the boat, gasping for air. Mark looked around, his heart still pounding. The creature had stopped moving, but it was still there, its massive body just beneath the surface. He could feel its presence, watching them from the depths. The lifeboat was still rocking, but they were safe, at least for now. The rest of the crew was in the boat, too, their faces pale and filled with fear. Captain Holloway was gripping the oars tightly, his face grim. "We're not out of danger yet," he said, his voice low. "We need to keep moving." Mark nodded, trying to steady his breathing. He looked back at the creature, which was still circling them from below. It hadn't given up, and it wasn't going to let them go that easily. The ocean around them seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if the creature was calling out to something even bigger, even more dangerous. But the crew couldn't afford to think about that right now. They had to escape. They had to survive. Holloway shouted orders, and the crew began rowing again, their arms moving in unison. Mark could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he pushed the fear aside. They had a chance to survive, but only if they kept moving. The creature remained below them, waiting, watching, but Mark didn't dare look back again. Instead, he focused on the rhythmic motion of the oars, the steady beat that kept them moving forward. The open water was still a long way off, but they were no longer trapped. They had escaped the worst of it, at least for now. The feeling of relief was short-lived, though. As the crew rowed farther from the creature, the air grew heavier, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The sea seemed to whisper, its waves lapping gently against the sides of the boat. But there was something else, something watching from the dark depths. The creature might have been gone, but the ocean had a way of holding its secrets. The lifeboat floated on the open sea, rocking gently with the waves. The creature was no longer visible beneath the surface, but the crew couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. The air felt thick, heavy with the unspoken fear that lingered in each of them. No one spoke for several long moments as they rowed, their eyes scanning the dark waters around them, half expecting the creature to appear at any moment. Captain Holloway was the first to break the silence. His voice was hoarse, as if the events of the past hours had drained the strength from him. "We've made it this far, but we can't stop now." Mark nodded, still shaken by the close call. He had never experienced anything like that in his life. The terror he felt when the creature's massive body had risen from the depths was something he would never forget. He couldn't even imagine how close he had been to not making it back to the boat. But now wasn't the time to dwell on what had happened. They had to keep moving. The lifeboat was small, and the crew had to work together to stay on course. They rowed in silence, the only sound the steady rhythm of the oars in the water. Every few minutes, Mark glanced over the edge of the boat, expecting to see the creature's dark shape rising from the depths. But each time, the sea remained calm. Hours passed, and the sky began to lighten as dawn approached. The fear that had gripped them all began to fade, replaced by exhaustion. The tension that had been so thick earlier started to ease as they realized that, for now, they were safe. They had made it through the worst of it. But even as the sun began to rise, Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. He glanced at the horizon, where the faint outline of land was beginning to appear. They were heading in the right direction, but the ocean still seemed vast and endless. The creature was gone, but the memory of its presence remained, like a dark cloud hanging over them. Captain Holloway spoke again, his voice steady. "We'll make it to land, but we need to be prepared for anything. This, whatever we saw out there, it wasn't a normal creature, and I don't think we've seen the last of it." The crew nodded in agreement. No one dared to speak the thoughts that lingered in their minds, that the creature wasn't the only thing hiding in the depths of the ocean. There were mysteries in the sea that they could never understand, things that might never be seen by human eyes again. The sea had its secrets, and sometimes those secrets were better left undiscovered. As they continued to row toward land, the first rays of sunlight touched the water, casting a golden glow across the surface. For a brief moment, Mark felt a sense of peace, as if the worst was finally behind them. But deep down, he knew that the ocean would always hold its mysteries, and as long as they sailed its waters, they would never truly be free from the unknown. The journey back to land was long, but as the crew finally made it to the shore, they could only look back at the open water with a mixture of relief and fear. They had survived, but they knew that the ocean would always be out there, with its secrets waiting to be uncovered. And who knew what else might be lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the next crew to sail too close.